Welcome to video 2 in the Standard Library Fixed Object module. In this video we'll talk about the sync object from the Standard Library, and then we'll build an initial source sync model that uses the sync object along with the source object that we discussed in the previous video. The sync object is a fairly straightforward object that has two basic functions. First of all, it destroys entities, so you are finished processing an entity, you can send it to a sync object. And secondly, it automatically records the time and system for any entities that are sent to that object. It also has optional assignments and some other functions that we'll see later on in the course. So this is the basic source and sync model that we're going to use to talk about the sync behavior, and then also to talk a little bit more about the general source behavior that we talked about in the previous video. So the first thing I'm going to do to build this simple model is drag a source object instance, place it, drag a sync object instance, and place it in the facility view. And then I'm going to use a time path between the source and sync object. And I'm going to specify the time, or I'm going to use the default value actually, of 1 minute. And so you can see that this is the model that we just created. We have a source, we didn't change any of the arrival properties. Sync, we didn't change any of its properties. And then we placed a time path in between those. And so by simply placing those objects, I can now run my model. And so you can see entities are created. Again, we're using the default arrival mode. We'll talk about that here in just a second. Entities travel in a fixed time of exactly 1 minute and go to the sync. And as we said, the sync object has two basic functions. One is to destroy entities, so when they go into the sync object, they're destroyed. And secondly, to record the time and system. So let me just go fast forward. And so we can see that we ran for 24 hours, which again is the default. When I created the model, I didn't make any changes. And so then I can go to the results tab, and we can see that I have sync1 is my sync object instance, and so we recorded the average time in system. And so since we have a time path with a fixed time of 1 minute, we would expect this to be exactly 1 minute, which is 0.0167 of an hour. Also note that when we look at the default entity, it also records the time and system. So we have the default entity object instance, and so it's one of its population statistics is its time and system. And so these two, in this case, are redundant because we're recording the information associated with the entity population and also with the entities that go through this particular sync. However, if we were to go in and say add another sync, so let's go say, what if we add a sync 2? And this time let's put a time path, and let's specify this time the time to traverse the path being 2 minutes rather than the default of 1 minute. So now I have entities that can traverse to sync 1 in 1 minute or to sync 2 in 2 minutes. And because I didn't change any of the properties associated with my time paths, the selection, 50% are going to go this way and 50% are going to go this way, chosen randomly. So I can just hit go, watch several of these, and you can see they're making a random selection. It looks, at least initially, like a lot more going down here, but I think if we run it long enough, you would see that it's a 50% split. But if we fast forward to our 24 hours and then go back and look at those same results, now we see that our default entity, the time and system, is 0.0249. Again, we would expect it to be halfway between 1 and 2 minutes. And now we have two different sync objects. So we have the initial sync, sync 1, and its time is 0.0167, again exactly 1 minute as we saw before. And sync 2, the flow time is exactly 2 minutes because that's the time that we specified and we have no randomness. And so in this case, I have three different measures of time and system. I have the population, the default entity population, all entities in the population. Then I have the subset of that population that went to sync 1, and the subset that went to sync 2. And so it turns out that having this time and system automatically recorded is quite useful when we're building models. Okay, so let's remove sync 2 and go back to our base, the base model that we started with. And now what I want to do is I want to go back and revisit some of the arrival modes that we talked about in the previous video. So again, when we go to source 1 and we look over here in the properties, specify the entity type. The arrival mode specifies what process is used for entity creation or entity arrival. And so the default one that you see most often is something called inner arrival time. And so in this case, I can specify a starting time, or I can specify what that random time is. So for example, if I wanted entities to arrive, say, every 1 minute exactly, I would simply have the value 1, so I don't have any randomness whatsoever. And so now an entity is going to arrive every 1 minute. It's going to take exactly 1 minute to traverse from source 1 to sink 1. And recall from our discussion of the expression builder, if I simply go and click on the down arrow, I can type random, hit the period, and you can see all of the random probability distributions that are available for use. And I can also, let me cancel out of here. I can always go back and reset back to the default value of random exponential 0.25. So that's the inner arrival time. The second basic mode that we talked about is a time varying arrival rate. And so for a time varying arrival rate, if we select that, you can see that we have an error here because we have specified that we want to use a rate table, but we haven't specified what rate table to use. And so we see this salmon color here indicating this is where the error is, and then we can see it also down here at the bottom where we list the number of list the errors that are in the model. So in this case, I would have to go to my data tab, and I want to select rate tables, and we'll create a new rate table. And you can see by default you specify the interval size and the number of intervals. And so we've basically, by default, we have 1 hour intervals for a 24-hour period. So if I wanted to say make 2 periods, make this easy on me. So I just change that 1 hour period to 2, and now I can specify the number of events per hour. So if I did say 10 for the first one, and 5 for the second one, for the second period, this would say that for 1 hour I'm going to have entities that arrive at the rate of 10 per hour, and for the next hour I will have entities that arrive at the rate of 5 per hour. And so now I have rate table 1. I can go back and specify or fix my error because I now have rate table 1. And so now when I execute, we can see that entities, well, I have to speed it up a little bit. We're going to arrive 10 per hour. Let's make it a little bit faster. And so there's our first entity, our second, third, fourth, and so on. And so we'd see here down we're at 0.4 hours. When we get to the second hour, our arrivals are going to slow down. It's a little bit difficult to see in this model because I chose values that are relatively low. But I could easily fix that. Let me just stop the model, go back, and let's just make these faster. So let's just say we want 60 events per hour. So this would be 1 arrival every minute on average. And let's make the second hour 120. And so if we run, now we're seeing entities arrive 1 per minute. And when we get to hour 1, that arrival rate's going to double. And so we should see twice as many entities arriving once we get to 1. So let's go back here and let's make this 15. Get us to 1 hour pretty quickly. So right here, we're almost there. Now we're at 1 hour, and you can see that it does appear that the arrival rate has increased significantly. One thing to note when you look at using an arrival table is that it implements what's called a non-stationary Poisson process. And so although these numbers appear deterministic, the 60 per hour is actually a Poisson arrival process. So the inner arrival times would be exponentially distributed with a mean of 1 over 60 for the first hour and 1 over 120 for the second hour. The next arrival mode we'll look at is the on event. And so again, we see the error because we have specified an on event arrival mode, but we haven't specified what's called the triggering event. So we think about what an event is. An event is something that happens instantaneously in simulated time, and it's something of interest to us. So for example, let's say that I wanted to create an entity every time an entity exited, right? So one thing that I could do is, I could go back and again use the expression editor, and I'll just scroll down and look for my sync object. And so here's my input at sync 1 entered or exited, and so let's just pick input at sync 1 exited. And so what this says is every time the event fires, in other words when an entity exits the sync input, create a new event, create a new entity. And so if we run that, and the first thing we see is we don't have any entities. And the reason we don't have any entities is because we didn't specify to create an initial entity. We just said we want to create entities whenever an entity leaves, but unless we create an initial entity, that'll never happen. So an entity can't leave if we don't have one. So we'll just set that to 1 and create an entity to start with, and then we see every time an entity departs, we create another entity. And so that on event is useful if you want to create an entity when a particular event within your model happens. It turns out that that's a very useful arrival mode. And finally, we'll look at the arrival table. So once again, we've specified an arrival table, but we have an error because we haven't said which table property to use. And so again, let's go back to data, and this time we'll just make a regular table or a general table. So we'll just add table, call it table 1, and I'm just going to add one property. Let's a real property, and let's change this to arrive time. And let's just give the first value 0, 1, 2, let's do 0.1 and 0.2. So we have three entries in our table, and the arrive time is 0.1, 0.2. I go back to my facility, and now I can fix the error by saying I want table 1 arrive time. So note I specified the table, and then I also have to specify the arrival time property. And as we see down here in the help, it's the numeric table property or column that contains the discrete times when entities occur. So we hit enter, and we had our first entity at time 1. We had our time 0, time 0.1, and time 0.2. And since those are all the entities in the table, those are all the arrivals that we'll have. We'll see many more examples of using all of these arrival modes in subsequent videos within the course. And so the last thing I want to talk about in this video are stopping conditions. So let me go back and reset this to its default, the arrival mode back to enter arrival time. And then again, we can just click run to watch and make sure it's behaving like we think it does. Which of course it is, because we haven't really made any changes. And this time let's go back and look at the stopping conditions. And let's say I want to stop after the first entity. I'm going to just put a number of the number of maximum arrivals 1. We create one entity. The source then stops creating entities, but the simulation time progresses. So if you have a finite number or deterministic number that you want to have for your maximum, you can set it there. It turns out that this is a really nice debugging tool when you're working on models and you're trying to find an error. You can set the stopping condition so that you can just either trace 1 or 2 entities through the system. As mentioned before, we can also set a maximum simulation time. So if I reset this one and then go back and let's set this one to say 1 hour, and then as I run, we still have it running pretty fast here. We're at 0.25, so in just a little bit we'll get to 1 hour, and then as we do that we'll see that the source stops creating entities. I should have set it to 0.5 and we'd be done by now, but here we are at 1 hour, and so you can see that time is still advancing, but we are no longer creating entities. And finally, we can have a stop event name, so I could create an event that stops that stops the source from creating entities. So I'm not going to demonstrate that here, but we'll see that a little bit later on. And so that concludes video number 2. And so now we have introduced the first 2 objects from the fixed objects from the standard library, source object, sync object, and looked at a little sample model building.